The patrol had been moving for 2 days without water. Not 2 days without enough water. 2 days without any water at all. There were 11 men. They were somewhere in the Sonoran Desert, in what is now southern Arizona, in the summer of 1872. The temperature had been above 110 degrees for 3 consecutive days. 2 of the horses had already stopped moving. 1 soldier had lost the ability to speak. Another had begun walking in the wrong direction and had to be physically turned around by the man behind him. The lieutenant in charge, a man named George Forsyth, had a map. The map showed a river approximately 12 miles to the east. They had walked 12 miles east. There was no river. There was cracked earth, white rock, and a sky so pale with heat it looked like it had been bleached. Forsyth had done everything his training told him to do. He had rationed the remaining water. He had kept the men moving at dawn and at dusk. He had ordered them to cover their heads and mouths. None of it was enough because the fundamental problem was not technique. The fundamental problem was that he did not know where the water was. The Apache scout traveling with the patrol, a man the soldiers called by the name all day though that was not his real name, had said nothing for most of the morning. He had been watching things that the soldiers were not watching. He had been reading things that had no meaning inside Forsyth's framework. At around midday Alday stopped walking. He looked at a section of dry ground that appeared identical, to every soldier present, to every other section of dry ground they had crossed that day. He knelt down. He pressed his palm flat against the surface and held it there for a long moment. Then he stood, pointed slightly north of where they had been heading and said 2 words. "This way." Forsyth looked at the ground where the scout had knelt. He looked at the direction the scout was pointing. He saw nothing. No depression in the earth. No vegetation. No shadow. No sign of any kind that he could identify. But 11 men were dying and he had no better option. They walked for 40 minutes in the direction Alday had indicated. And then, in a shallow draw between 2 low ridges, hidden beneath a shelf of rock that would have been completely invisible from any other angle, they found water. A seep, slow, not a spring, not a stream, but water. Cold, clean water pushing up through the sand at a rate that would fill a canteen in about 4 minutes. It took them 3 hours to water the horses and fill every container they had. That night, Forsyth wrote in his field journal. He described the water, the location, the condition of his men. And then, at the end of the entry he wrote a single sentence that he would return to for the rest of his career. He wrote, "I do not know what he saw that I did not see." That question, what did the Apache scout see that the trained soldier could not, is exactly what this video is going to answer. To understand why American soldiers were so stunned by Apache water finding, you first need to understand what they knew and where that knowledge came from. The U.S. Army officers and enlisted men who operated in the Southwest in the 1860s and 1870s came mostly from the East. Many had fought in the Civil War. They had trained in military doctrine developed for European-style warfare: open fields, supply lines, reliable rivers, temperate climate. They understood logistics in the sense of calculating how much water a column of men would consume over a given number of miles, based on known water sources at known intervals. The desert did not operate on that logic. The desert had water. In fact, the Sonoran and Chihuahuan deserts contain significantly more water than their surface appearance suggests. But that water is hidden. It is underground, trapped beneath rock, locked inside plants, pooling in formations that are invisible unless you know the specific language of the landscape. The Army's approach to desert water was essentially a mapping approach. Find the known sources, rivers, lakes, established wells, mark them on a map and plan movement around those marks. If the map was wrong or if a known source had dried up, or if the patrol was forced off its planned route, the system collapsed entirely. This is what had happened to Forsyth. His map showed a river. The river was not there, or rather, it had receded to a subsurface flow that summer, a phenomenon that happened regularly in that terrain and that any experienced Apache tracker would have known how to read. But Forsyth had no way of knowing that a dry riverbed was not an absent river. To him dry meant gone. To Alday dry was just a different kind of present. The soldiers carried water. The Apache scouts read the land. Those are not the same strategy. And in the desert they are not equally effective. The Apache relationship with water in the desert was not instinct. Let me be direct about that because there is a tendency in popular accounts to describe indigenous survival skills as some form of natural intuition. Something innate, something racial, something mysterious. That is not what this was. What the Apache had was a comprehensive, multi-generational, empirically developed system of environmental knowledge. It had been built over centuries of living in one of the most demanding landscapes on Earth. It was passed from older trackers to younger ones with a precision that rivaled any formal education, because the consequences of getting it wrong were immediate and fatal. They were not guessing. They were reading. And the language they were reading was written across the desert in signs that are, once you know what to look for, completely legible. Here is what that system looked like in practice. The first layer was vegetation. Certain plants are what botanists call phreatophytes, plants with root systems deep enough to reach the permanent water table. In the Sonoran Desert, the most reliable of these is the cottonwood tree. A cottonwood does not grow where there is no water. It cannot. Its survival requires consistent underground moisture. If you see a cottonwood or a line of cottonwoods, you are seeing a map. The roots tell you where the water is and the tree tells you where the roots are. The same principle applies to willows, to seep willow in particular, and to a desert plant called the arrowweed, which grows in dense stands specifically along underground water channels. The Apache knew which plants were indicators and which were not. They knew the difference between a plant that could survive on minimal surface moisture and a plant that required subsurface water to exist at all. That distinction, repeated across dozens of species, gave them a botanical map of water sources that covered the entire territory they moved through. The second layer was animal behavior. Desert animals know where water is because their survival depends on it with the same urgency that the soldiers experienced, but every single day of their lives. The Apache watched animals not as prey only, but as a navigational system. Bees in particular were critical. A bee will travel in a straight line toward its hive from a water source. If you observe bees moving in a consistent direction and you follow that direction, you will find water within a distance that bees are physically capable of traveling, rarely more than a few miles. The Apache knew this. They would watch the flight pattern of bees with the same attention a navigator gives to a compass. Doves and quail in the desert drink twice a day, at dawn and at dusk. They always fly toward water in the morning and away from it in the evening. If you observe a significant number of doves flying in a consistent direction at dawn, they are telling you exactly where water is. The Apache could read the flight patterns of birds with enough precision to determine not just direction but approximate distance, based on how high the birds were flying and how urgently they were moving. Ants also carry water knowledge. Certain species of desert ant build their colonies in locations where soil moisture is higher than the surrounding ground. A large ant colony in otherwise dry terrain is a subsurface moisture indicator that the Apache consistently used. The third layer was geology. Water follows rock. In the desert southwest, limestone and granite formations create specific drainage patterns that concentrate water in predictable locations. A V-shaped cut in a rock face, even one that appears completely dry, will hold water in a depression at its base after any rainfall, and in the desert, even a rainfall of 2 weeks ago can leave residual moisture in the right geological formation. The Apache knew the geology of their territory in the way that a person knows the rooms of their own house. They knew which rock types held water and which did not. They knew which formations created natural cisterns and where those cisterns were located across hundreds of miles of terrain. The fourth layer was soil. Different soils hold water differently. Caliche, a hardened calcium carbonate layer that forms just below the surface in desert soils, creates an impermeable barrier that forces water to pool above it rather than drain downward. If you know what caliche looks like from the surface, and the Apache did, you know where water is likely to be sitting just a few inches underground, invisible but accessible if you dig. This is what Alday was reading when he pressed his palm to the ground in front of Forsyth's patrol. He was not performing a ritual. He was checking soil temperature and moisture content, two indicators that, when combined with the vegetation and geological features he had been reading all morning, confirmed what he had already suspected. There was a seep beneath the rock shelf 40 minutes north of where they were standing. He did not see it. He read it. From a dozen different signals, accumulated over a morning of observation, cross-referenced against a lifetime of knowledge. In the spring of 1883, General George Crook led an unprecedented expedition into the Sierra Madre Mountains of northern Mexico, the stronghold of the Chiricahua Apache under the leadership of Geronimo and Chato. It was one of the most audacious military operations in the history of the Apache Wars, and it would have been completely impossible without Apache scouts. Crook took nearly 200 Apache scouts with him. He understood something that many of his contemporaries did not. That the only force capable of operating effectively in Apache territory was one that moved and thought the way the Apache moved and thought. The U.S. Army alone could not do it. With Apache scouts leading, it became possible. The column entered terrain that had never been mapped by any American military force. They were moving through mountains, canyons, and desert stretches where water was not marked on any chart because no chart maker had ever been there. For 6 weeks, the column operated without a single day of critical water shortage. The officers kept records of this, and those records are remarkable. Again and again, the Apache scouts would lead the column to water in locations that defied every expectation. A dry canyon that appeared to offer nothing, and then a scout would climb a particular outcropping, study the rock formations below, descend, and lead the column to a crack in the base of a cliff face where cold water seeped through at a steady rate. A flat, featureless plain that the officers had been dreading for 2 days, and then the scouts would fan out, read the ground for 20 minutes, and reconvene on a low spot where, 2 feet below the surface, water-saturated sand could be scooped into containers. One officer, Captain Emmett Crawford, wrote in his report that the scouts appeared to know where water was before they arrived anywhere near it. He described watching a scout named So study the flight of birds from a ridgeline for approximately 15 minutes, then turn to the column and indicate a direction with complete confidence. They followed the direction for several miles and found a spring that Crawford estimated could supply the entire column for 3 days. Crawford, to his credit, asked So how he had known. The answer, as translated by the interpreter, was something along these lines: "The birds told me." Crawford noted that he had seen the same birds and they had told him nothing. The difference was not the birds. It was 20 years of watching birds in that specific landscape until their behavior had become a readable language. Crook's expedition succeeded. He made contact with the Chiricahua leadership deep in the Sierra Madre and began the negotiations that would ultimately lead to Geronimo's first surrender. The military history books focus on the diplomacy. But the expedition would never have reached the negotiation point without the water knowledge of the Apache scouts who kept 200 men alive in terrain that should have been impassable. There is something important to understand about how this knowledge actually worked, because it is easy to describe individual techniques and miss the larger point. The Apache scouts were not applying a checklist. They were not running through a sequence of steps. What they were doing was something closer to simultaneous, integrated reading of an entire environment. The way a skilled musician does not hear individual notes but hears a piece of music as a complete structure. Every piece of information they gathered was cross-referenced against every other piece. The direction of bird flight was meaningful, but it became more meaningful when combined with the presence of a specific plant at the base of a particular rock formation, which became more meaningful when combined with the angle of a dry wash and the color variation in a patch of soil 200 yards back. None of these signals was definitive alone. Together, they converged on a conclusion with a precision that appeared to outside observers as something supernatural. It was not supernatural. It was the result of training that began in childhood and never stopped. Apache children learned to read the desert the way other children learn to read text, through constant exposure, patient instruction from people who already knew, and the gradual internalization of a system until it became automatic. By the time a man reached adulthood in an Apache community, he had been reading the desert for his entire conscious life. The signals that were invisible to a soldier from Virginia or Ohio were as obvious to him as a road sign. This is what made the knowledge so difficult to transfer and so easy to dismiss. A soldier who watched an Apache scout find water in a dry canyon could acknowledge the result without understanding the process. And without understanding the process, the most natural explanation was luck, or instinct, or some vague cultural gift that certain people had and others did not. The idea that it was a learnable, teachable, systematic skill, just one built on a foundation that took years to construct, was harder to accept, because accepting it meant acknowledging that the scout possessed a form of expertise that the formally educated officer did not have and could not quickly acquire. That acknowledgement was uncomfortable. So most of the time it was avoided. Most Army officers maintained a respectful distance from the knowledge of their Apache scouts. They used it, they depended on it, and they did not examine it. A few did something different. John Gregory Burke was a captain and aide-de-camp to General Crook who spent years in the field with Apache scouts and became one of the most serious documenters of Apache knowledge and culture in the 19th century. Burke was unusual because he was genuinely curious, not in the condescending way of someone collecting curiosities, but in the way of someone who suspected that what he was witnessing had more substance than his framework allowed for. He began asking questions. Through interpreters, through long evenings in camp, through patient observation over years, he assembled an understanding of Apache environmental knowledge that he documented in journals and published accounts. He was not always right. He sometimes misunderstood what he was told, and his cultural framework limited what he could interpret. But he was honest and he was rigorous, and his records contain some of the most detailed first-hand accounts of Apache tracking and water-finding techniques available from the period. Burke documented the bird-reading system with enough specificity that a modern ornithologist reading his account would recognize the behavior he was describing and confirm its validity. He documented the plant indicator system with enough botanical detail that later ethnobotanists were able to identify the specific species and verify their relationship to subsurface water. He documented the geological reading techniques in terms that a modern hydrologist would find largely accurate. What Burke understood and wrote explicitly was that the Apache relationship with the desert was not primitive. It was sophisticated in ways that his civilization had not developed because it had not needed to. European-American expansion into the desert brought technology, wells, irrigation, eventually pumps and pipelines. The Apache had developed knowledge instead of technology because knowledge was what the desert required of anyone who wanted to live there without external infrastructure. Technology could run out. Knowledge could not. Another officer who engaged seriously with Apache water knowledge was Lieutenant John Bigelow, who served in the Southwest in the 1880s and kept detailed journals of his campaigns. Bigelow noted something that Burke also observed. The Apache scouts could not only find water, they could assess its quality without testing it, determining from the appearance of surrounding vegetation and soil whether a water source was potable or alkaline, which in the desert Southwest was a critical distinction. Alkaline water in sufficient quantities is toxic. Finding a water source and then drinking water that made your soldiers sick was worse than not finding water at all. The scouts could read the difference from the plant life around a seep or spring. Specific plants that tolerated alkalinity growing in certain patterns indicated water that should not be consumed. Different plants indicated water that was safe. This botanical toxicology, the ability to assess water chemistry through vegetation, was a layer of knowledge that went entirely beyond what the Army's approach could offer. A canteen of bad water in the Sonoran Desert could kill faster than no water at all. The scouts knew which water to drink and which to avoid, and they knew it before they took a single sip. The Apache Wars ended in 1886 with the final surrender of Geronimo. What followed was a systematic destruction of the conditions that had produced and sustained Apache desert knowledge. The Chiricahua Apache were forcibly relocated, first to Florida, then to Alabama, then eventually to Oklahoma. They were removed from the specific landscape that their knowledge was built around. A generation of children grew up without access to the Sierra Madre, the Sonoran Desert, the specific rock formations and plant communities and seasonal water patterns that their knowledge described. Knowledge of this kind does not transfer in the abstract. You cannot learn to read a landscape from a book about a different landscape. The botanical indicators for water in southern Arizona are specific to southern Arizona. The geological formations that create reliable seeps in the Chihuahuan Desert are specific to the Chihuahuan Desert. When the people who held that knowledge were removed from the land it described, the knowledge began to erode in a way that could not be entirely reversed. Some of it survived. Apache communities maintained portions of this knowledge through oral tradition, through the efforts of specific elders who prioritized its transmission, and in some cases through the work of ethnographers who documented what they could before it was gone. But significant portions were lost, not because the knowledge was inherently fragile, but because the conditions required to sustain and transmit it were deliberately destroyed. This matters beyond its historical dimension because it represents something that no amount of archival research can fully recover. The knowledge that allowed Alday to lead 11 dying men to water in 40 minutes, that specific integrated landscape-level reading ability, existed in its complete form in the minds of people who are gone, applied to a landscape that has been substantially altered, in a cultural context that was systematically dismantled. What remains is enough to understand the outline, enough to verify through modern science that the underlying principles were sound. But the complete system in its living form is largely gone. Beginning in the 20th century, hydrologists, botanists, and ecologists began studying the desert Southwest with tools that the Apache scouts had never possessed, and they kept arriving at the same conclusions. Phreatophyte mapping, the formal scientific practice of using deep-rooted vegetation to locate subsurface water, is now a standard technique in arid land hydrology. The cottonwood and willow indicator system that Apache scouts used intuitively is now documented in scientific literature with enough rigor that it is taught in university hydrology courses. The principle is the same. The language is different. Animal behavior as a water indicator, the use of bee flight patterns and dove movement to locate water sources, has been studied by behavioral ecologists and confirmed as reliable under controlled conditions. Bees do fly in straight lines between water and hive. Doves in the desert do move toward water at dawn and away from it at dusk with enough consistency to serve as a directional indicator. These are not myths. They are documented, reproducible behaviors that the Apache tracked and read with precision. The soil reading techniques, including the identification of caliche layers and moisture retention patterns, align with principles now taught in soil science and desert ecology. A soil scientist looking at the description of what Alday did when he pressed his palm to the ground would recognize a rudimentary version of techniques used today to assess subsurface moisture without instrumentation. None of this means the Apache scouts were proto-scientists in the modern sense. Their framework was entirely different, relational rather than mechanistic, oral rather than written, embedded in cultural practice rather than abstracted into academic discipline. But the knowledge produced by that framework, tested against the hardest possible standard, survival in one of the most demanding environments on Earth, was accurate. Measurably, verifiably, consistently accurate. The U.S. Army could not have operated in the Apache homeland without Apache scouts. That is not a romantic statement. It is a logistical fact documented in official military records. Campaign after campaign that attempted to operate without native scouts failed, not from lack of courage or resources, but from lack of knowledge. The landscape was not hostile to human life. It sustained the Apache entirely. It was hostile to people who could not read it. George Forsyth, the lieutenant who had followed Alday across that dry desert floor in the summer of 1872, lived a long career in the Army. He fought in multiple campaigns, was decorated multiple times, and eventually retired with a distinguished record. In his memoir written near the end of his life, he returned to that afternoon. He described it in more detail than almost anything else he had experienced in the field. The dying horses, the soldier who had lost the ability to speak, the cracked white earth stretching in every direction with no indication of anything beneath it. And Alday kneeling, pressing his palm flat, standing, pointing, this way. Forsyth wrote that in 40 years of military service, in combat and in the field across multiple wars and territories, he had never felt as completely helpless as he had felt in that moment before he decided to follow the scout. He knew everything the Army had taught him and none of it was sufficient. He was standing on top of the answer and he could not see it. He also wrote something that very few military memoirs of the era contain, a direct acknowledgement that the knowledge he had witnessed was not primitive, not luck, and not instinct. He wrote that Alday understood the desert the way a ship's navigator understands the sea, not by dominating it, not by carrying enough supplies to be independent of it, but by reading it fluently in every direction at every moment, until the land itself told him where to go. Forsyth never learned to read the desert the way Alday did. He was honest about that. It was not the kind of knowledge you could acquire in a campaign or a season. It was the kind of knowledge that required a life. What he could do and what he did was trust it. And that trust, on a July afternoon in the Sonoran Desert, was the difference between 11 graves in the sand and 11 men who made it home. If something in this story stayed with you, whether it was the soldier who could not see what was right beneath him, the bees flying in a straight line toward water, or the scout who pressed his palm to the ground and read what no map could show, leave it in the comments below. Because the things that stay with us are the things worth remembering. And this is history that deserves to be remembered.